This evening it's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, an ambassador whom I've known for a number of years, and on a topic which I think is very, very timely and very, very pertinent for us all. So it's really good to see everybody here. Brigitte Collet has been the ambassador for negotiations on climate change, renewable energy and climate risk prevention since late 2016. And before that has had a distinguished career in the French Foreign Service, including in Africa, to the United Nations in New York, ambassador in Oslo, and more recently than that, ambassador in Ethiopia. And that's where our paths first crossed, when I was ambassador to Ethiopia as well. And it was Madame Collet who was kind enough to tell me before I took flight for Paris that the nearest restaurant of any quality was Le Basilique, very close to our new embassy. So it's a special pleasure, Brigitte, that you are here in Wellington to sample some of our cuisine after your work. Madame Collet is here for climate change discussions with her New Zealand counterpart. And I think we'll have a chance to, I hope, see a little bit of Wellington in the next couple of days. And I'm just taking the opportunity now to say that we have not one but two experts in climate change negotiations here, because Adrian Macey was our first New Zealand climate change ambassador, a former ambassador in Paris, and now Adjunct Professor at the Climate Change Research Institute at this university, and a Senior Associate at the Institute of Policy Governance, Policy Studies, with whom we work very closely. And it's always important for the Institute to be working alongside the university, which is kind enough to house us in its institutions and to allow us to invite people to meetings here. So without further ado, I'm going to call upon Madame Collet, who will talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then Adrian is going to begin the process of a question and answer. He will open the floor eventually to all, but as someone very much involved in this work, I think it will be interesting to see how the two of them interact first before opening the floor to you all. So welcome everybody. I'm James Kemper. I'm the chair of the research committee of the Institute, and it's a great pleasure on behalf of our president, Sir Anand Sachinand, to welcome you all here tonight. So now I give the floor with great pleasure, Madame Collet. Merci.
Bonsoir. Good evening. It's a true pleasure for me to be here this afternoon with you. I'd like to thank you very much, James, for your very kind introduction and also the memories of Addis and Paris together. And I'm very grateful to the Institute for inviting me to meet with you this afternoon. I'm in charge of the climate team, in charge of the negotiations for France, and we are very much focusing also on international cooperation when it comes to action. So I will talk a bit about this also. If I'm here today, it's because when Prime Minister Arden met with President Macron for the first time in Paris in 2018, a joint declaration was issued, and the first section of this declaration is about working together for the sustainability of the planet, the fight against climate change, and for the environment. And in this declaration, it was envisaged that we would hold annual senior climate officials consultations in capitals. So we had the first session last year in Paris, and I'm glad to be here today for the second session of those consultations, which took place all day today before coming here. These consultations are an opportunity to jointly take stock of the international situation when it comes to climate, and to do and look at our two ambitious countries, New Zealand and France, can contribute to a more effective fight against climate change. We have a lot in common. We share a strong sense of urgency. Being two nations in the Pacific, we see the impact in the region, and I believe our two leaders consider that it is the challenge of our generation. For France, the fight against climate change is a very high priority domestically, in the European Union, and also at the global level. So I will try to present what are our commitments at those three levels. So first, what is France doing domestically to combat climate change? And here maybe a word about where we come from. For the government, we are in a state of climate urgency. The dramatic consequences of climate change are felt also and are visible in France. For instance, Hurricane Irma struck very severely Saint-Barthélemy and Saint-Martin, French departments in the Caribbean. We've seen very severe floods and more frequent in the south of France. We've seen heat waves and droughts last year affecting the citizens but also the farmers. This winter is extraordinarily mild, and there is no snow in some of the mountains of France, which is quite exceptional, and this has an impact for the economic activities also in the region. To describe a bit where we are, amongst the developed countries, France is one of the lowest emitters, be it per capita, with, let's say, around 6 tons of CO2 per capita, and also per unit of GDP. We are in line with our European and international commitments, and actually our emissions have dropped by 16% from 1990, while the population grew by 15%, and the GDP by 49%. However, we consider this is not enough if we want to follow the recommendations of the IPCC 1.5 report, which says that we have to act extremely forcefully in the decade to come if we want to avoid the most dangerous consequences of climate change. So it is now that we have to really enhance our efforts. We also consider that the ecological transition brings very significant opportunities in terms of economic development, employment, living standards, public health, and also biodiversity protection. So this is where we come from. A number of very ambitious measures were decided in the past years and also in the past months. A climate plan was adopted in 2017 with new measures to reduce our emissions domestically, but also outside of our borders, because we are looking also at our overall carbon footprint. This plan sets a very clear objective: net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So this objective is now the basis for our long-term strategy, but it is also part of our legislation, meaning that the policies will have to adjust to this objective. To reach this goal, a number of more detailed measures have been decided, and I will just mention a few of them, such as banning the sales of GHG emitting cars as of 2040, encouraging public transportation, carpooling, the use of bicycle. We had a specific legislation on mobility last year. A very significant plan of building renovation for the 10 coming years to renovate the most energy-consuming buildings. A ban on all fossil fuel exploration and extraction in our national territory as of 2040. The shutdown of our remaining coal power plants by 2022. We put also the emphasis on research and innovation, and here I could in particular mention an effort on batteries together with Germany. The government has also a transformation project for agriculture, and we call it the agroecological project, which aims at having a more effective production system in all dimensions, so be it economic but also environmental, so taking into account reduction of emissions and also adaptation of agriculture. Recently, some measures were taken to make sure that the public services will also be more sustainable when it comes to saving energy, the use of plastic, using train rather than aircraft. So we have, this is one of the latest decisions. And finally, also a very important piece of legislation regarding the circular economy and entire waste to reduce the consumption of material, of energy, and also reduce the emissions of the waste treatment sector. Those measures, in fact, start delivering results. After a period in 2015, 2017, where the emissions were stable, they're now from 2018 starting to decline again, which is good news. We also have an adaptation plan. It is, in fact, already the second version of such a plan, but the minister in charge of the environment in France, and in fact the title is Minister for Ecological and Inclusive Transition, felt that the measures were not strong enough. So very recently there were new measures announced in order to prevent floods or to avoid buildings being destroyed due to the increase of the sea level. So this is for the most recent plans. Another thing we did was to establish new institutions to face this very severe threat. The first thing and those three institutions were established since November 2018. The first one is a High Council on Climate. It's an independent body made of experts, and its mission is to advise the government and make recommendations on the implementation of public policies to reduce all greenhouse gases emissions. It published its first report in June last year. And it's quite in the spirit of your recently established commission. The second one is the Ecological Defence Council. It's a council chaired by the President of the Republic and to which participate the Prime Minister and a selected number of ministers, but that would include obviously environment, but also foreign affairs, finance, overseas territories. And here it's a defense council, like we have a defense council for matters of peace and security or domestic security. Here it is about the environment, and the idea is to demonstrate that it is a very high priority, which deserves being dealt at the level of the president and the whole government. It has held already 4 meetings, and the last one was about adaptation. Finally, was established a Citizens' Convention on Climate. This Citizens' Convention brings together 150 French citizens drawn by lot. But at the same time representing the diversity of the French society. The mandate is to define measures that will enable us to meet our objectives in a spirit, this is very important, in a spirit of social justice. Those citizens meet at weekends, not all weekends, but I would say 2 weekends each month. They hold hearings, they convene officials. The president met with them, ministers, scientists, experts, NGOs, in order to form their own opinion, and from there to be able to draft measures. And the plenary sessions actually are web streamed live. The Citizens' Climate Convention should forward its conclusion to the French government on the 4th of April. And our president committed to submitting these proposals without filter, either to a vote in Parliament or to direct implementation, or maybe to a referendum. So we will see what contains the report of the convention, and we will see what is the follow-up. So we've put in place 3 quite innovative institutions to ensure that the transition is treated as a priority and is also dealt in a socially acceptable manner. Now, if I come from the domestic level to the EU level, what's happening in the EU for us is a key priority. First, as you may know, France belongs to the European NDC. There is a French national determined contribution. There is a French nationally determined contribution only for the 6 overseas territories, including Polynesia, New Caledonia, and Wallis and Futuna. But essentially, we go through the EU NDC. So for us, it is essential that the EU be really active and ambitious. And we've been working very hard last year to achieve what was achieved on the 12th of December during a council of the EU heads of state and government, who decided that the EU should aim at carbon neutrality by 2050. At the same time, the newly appointed European Commission presented its Green Deal. And I'd like to say a few words about this Green Deal, which is a very comprehensive plan which deals both with climate but also biodiversity and environment. So I'll stick to the climate part. With this Green Deal, one of the intentions is to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. The roadmap, which is very comprehensive and goes through many sectors, plans to raise the EU ambition to 2030. Currently, we have an NDC which foresees a 40% reduction of the EU emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. The new proposal from the Commission is to raise this objective to between 50 and 55%, which is quite a significant increase, which we support. The EU will also present its long-term decarbonization strategy, the long-term strategy called for by the Paris Agreement. There is also an element in this deal of how do you assist regions of Europe to operate the transition. So what is proposed is to establish a just transition fund to support the efforts of the regions which need support for this transition. And we have in mind, first and foremost, the coal-producing or coal-using regions of Europe. There's also an element of regarding climate finance. The EU is already the first provider of public climate finance with 40% of this public finance coming from developed countries, but the idea is to increase this effort from the EU. So we're ready to lead by example and try to have other countries follow this movement of enhanced ambition, because we think it's absolutely indispensable if we want to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. But the EU is in fact only a small portion, I would say, of the global emissions. We represent between 9 and 10% of the global emissions, and our share is declining because we've been making efforts for a long time. Since 2017, and again in comparison always with 1990, the EU reduced by more than 19% its emission, when its GDP increased by 44%, and while the global emissions rose by 63%. So our share is really declining. Therefore, it is very important that we find many allies in this fight for enhanced ambition. Enhanced ambition by COP26 this year in November. So we have decided earlier this year in January that the EU institutions and the member states should engage very actively with partners to have this momentum of ambition. And we consider that the priority should be the G20 countries, because the G20 countries represent 80% of the global emissions. And we intend to focus on the main emitters. And the number one emitter, for instance, is China, with almost 30% of the world's emissions. So we will be exchanging a lot with China on this topic, but also with many other countries, and also interacting with the non-G20 countries, because we believe it is important that each country at its level and depending on its capacities participate to this movement. And we will, for this, support especially the most vulnerable countries, the LDCs, the least developed countries, the small island developing states, who are very ambitious, but maybe would need support to implement their plans. So we are fully engaged at the European level. We consider it as a priority. And for instance, tomorrow there is a meeting of the environment ministers of the EU. And in advance of this meeting, a group of 12 countries, including France, have been taking positions to make sure that we advance in time to be ready with a new NDC for COP26. Third level, this is the global level. And here, again, we're as active as we can. What is important for us? First, it is to support science and the IPCC. This is very important. So support can be political, of course, in the discussions, because the governments have to approve the summaries of the reports of the IPCC. And there are different views around the table, usually. But it is also financial support, especially since the US stopped funding the IPCC. So I believe that now we're the first contributor to the work of the IPCC. Second, we believe we have a special responsibility with vis-à-vis the Paris Agreement, because we were chairing COP21 and it was adopted in Paris. And this is why you may remember our president swiftly reacted to the announcement by President Trump that the US intended to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Of course, we regret this decision, but we believe that the Paris Agreement is strong. It now has 187 parties, so it's quite a sign of confidence from most of the world. We believe that it's important to find the right instruments to accelerate action. So this is why we organize a number of One Planet summits. The first one took place 6 months after the announcement of the US regarding the Paris Agreement. And one of the ideas was to demonstrate that the Paris Agreement was, the framework for action for the vast majority of countries, but also that non-state actors, including in the US, were active to fight climate change. And the intention was also to mobilize very much the non-state actors, local authorities, but also very much the economic and financial sector to accelerate action. We do believe that it's impossible to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement if we don't have the non-state actors fully on board. They need to be fully mobilized. And sometimes we can say that they can be more innovative and ambitious than governments. And they have a profound impact. We believe that when you establish coalitions of actors which are in a position to set standards in their field of activity, this can have a very important impact. So the first One Planet Summit was very much about climate finance, and there were commitments made by, for instance, a big insurance company to stop funding coal, for instance, or a group of sovereign wealth funds, including the New Zealand Fund, to come together and try to align their activities on the Paris Agreement. But there were many other initiatives. This One Planet Summit at first was very much focused on climate and how do you finance climate action, but now looks also very much at the topics of biodiversity and ocean. And this is because we believe that, in fact, climate and biodiversity are very much two faces of the same coin. So for us, 2020 is a critical year when it comes to climate with the new announced NDCs, but also biodiversity with the COP15 to be held in China, which should make it possible to have very clear and ambitious objectives to protect biodiversity. So we've been very engaged on the topic of finance. We hosted, for instance, the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund in Paris last October. And for us, the public finance, this type of international funds are very important, but maybe more importantly, what we have in mind is to contribute to the redirection of financial flows towards low carbon economy. It is one of the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We always have in mind the 2 degrees, but there are 3 objectives. One is to limit the temperatures to 2 degrees or possibly 1.5. The second is about the enhancement of adaptation and resilience. And the third one is about the redirection of financial flows. And we consider it as really, really essential. In a few months, we will be in Glasgow for COP26, and it is a topic we discussed, of course, with my New Zealand counterpart, Kay Harrison. COP26 will be a really important COP because it is when we expect the enhanced NDCs, the revised or updated NDCs, to be ready. We also have to finalize some piece of negotiation. So it will be a very, very important but not easy COP, because this movement of ambition is not so easy to generate. We will have other topics on the agenda. We will talk about finance. It's always a very delicate, I would say, discussion. We will be looking at the question of the $100 billion a year, which were promised by developed countries to support the action of developing countries from 2020. So this is going to be one of the topics. We are going to talk about the coalitions, the action agenda, how we can better cooperate to fully implement the Paris Agreement. So I was very happy today to have this opportunity to discuss all those topics with my New Zealand colleague. I think we share many views, really. We share concern, but also views about how to move ahead. For instance, New Zealand launched at the first One Planet Summit, New Zealand and the Marshall Islands launched a new coalition, the Carbon Neutrality Coalition, which now gathers about 30 countries, but also local authorities, businesses. And we discussed this and how to make sure that we can enlarge this group of participants to make sure that carbon neutrality becomes really the norm for all of us. So it is one of the more concrete things we discussed, apart from the political context and the negotiations. So for us, it's really a pleasure to be here, to be working with our colleagues, and to be working in an extremely constructive manner. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Brigitte, and you've given us a real great overview, not only of what's going on in France, where I noticed just about every topic you raised, we're also looking at in New Zealand at different stages, but also within Europe, and then looking more at the global picture. The idea was we'd perhaps draw out a few of the points initially, just the two of us, and then pass quickly over to the floor. I'd just make one personal comment myself. We're fortunate that we have, although this Paris Agreement has got some pieces that aren't quite finished, the rules aren't quite all in place yet, as Brigitte said, it has been a remarkable achievement. It's actually changed the global climate regime to one where we do not need to come back every year and renegotiate it. It wasn't the case under Kyoto. We had a 2008 to 2012 so-called commitment period. Nothing agreed after that. We've had to keep coming back and renegotiating. So that achievement, I also think, is perhaps the contribution of French diplomacy to Paris has been underestimated, because actually the product of work for well over 12 months before Paris and some extremely skillful management of the conference itself. And I personally feel that climate negotiators get a bit too much of the credit, and the French diplomacy not quite enough, but we'll probably see that as we go in the future. Just a couple of comments. I noticed, well, I would say that in terms of the common issues, you've come to New Zealand at a time when we're on the cusp of a year of major work with our Zero Carbon Act in place, and what's developing to be a gold standard carbon neutrality by 2050, or carbon zero by 2050, climate neutrality, not exactly the same formulation, but that's becoming the gold standard, at least for developed countries. We have the ETS, major consultation on adjusting the ETS underway, which is a huge job for officials, and then a brand new Climate Change Commission, more or less modelled on the UK committee. So that's all on our domestic agenda this year. Our complication of it is election year, and anyone that's hoping for new, bold climate policy during an election year is likely to be frustrated, I think. Just on the domestic scene in France, just a couple of questions. I was very interested in this Citizens' Convention, and I wonder whether it was, in a way, a throwback to the État Général before the Revolution. But can you just explain a little bit about the thinking behind it, and what sort of traction it's got with the French public? Is it something that the public understand and have expectations about and are anticipating the results of?
Thank you very much for your remarks regarding the COP21 presidency. I must say, at the time I was ambassador to Ethiopia with James, and I can tell you that we were receiving instructions all the time to be very active and meet all the key players, and so we worked very hard. I can tell you for this to happen. Coming to the Citizens' Climate Convention, it's, I believe, the very interesting public, interested by the topic of climate change, is following. And it's easy to follow. You have a website, you have the plenary sessions, which are very long sessions, webcasted live, and you can find them afterwards. So. But I'm not sure the general public yet is following this. I'm convinced that when the reports and the proposed measures by the convention come out, there will be a lot of interest. But at the moment, they are more into a working mode. So some pay a lot of attention to it, but not, it's not big news. All the time. It was on the news when the president, it was established, when the president came to meet them. But I think now we're waiting for the report. And let me be very clear about why it was established. You may remember the Yellow Vest movement in France. And there was a realization which was generated by an increase of the carbon tax on fuel. there was a realization at the time that if though people were not against action to fight climate change, there was an element of social acceptability of the measures which had not been taken into account. So this is why, after a number of months, came this idea to establish this assembly representative of the French society to look from their perspective what should be done, and therefore we could conclude what should be acceptable. So we're...
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's a bit of a parallel. We didn't have the yellow vest movement, and I didn't ever get tear gassed in New Zealand, but I was tear gassed twice in Nantes during yellow vest demonstrations last year. But we had a very abrupt announcement from the government: we're going to stop new offshore oil exploration licences, and that did create quite a reaction because initially there was nothing behind that, and people were concerned about future employment. So I think the point you're making about sort of the just transition, which is there in the Paris Agreement, is highly relevant for government to see. Just one point. I mean, it's very interesting for us because we are, it's big for New Zealand now right across the board, but thinking about your domestic landscape, okay, you've had the yellow vests, I think they may be calming down now, but then you've got a major issue now, which is pension reform, which is preoccupying the policy landscape. But in terms of climate policy, does this perhaps, what's the effect on climate policy? Does it mean perhaps that policies in your plan Climat, can continue sort of under the radar and keep being implemented, or do they policies tend to be halted or delayed because of other preoccupations?
They are not delayed, and they are certainly at a very high level of priority. What we are seeing, we are having municipal elections in March in France, mid-March. Most of the people running for elections are talking about climate and the environment, so it's not at all limited anymore to the Green Party. But I think, most of the political parties, including, I believe, the extreme right wing. So now it has to be part of the public agenda. Then the solutions can vary from one party to the other. But it's very significant. We had the European elections last year, and the Greens did very well in a number of European countries. And this is why the new Commission felt comfortable to move ahead with this quite transformative Green Deal, knowing that they would get a lot of support for this in the European Parliament. And we see the youth movement in many of European countries. So no, it is there.
And also, I think on the domestic front, I mean, there's often sort of conflicts of principle. I think you have a very ambitious target for getting rid of petrol-fueled cars by 2040. In New Zealand, we still love our gas guzzlers, but then the areas where you can sometimes get conflicts, I noticed that you in terms of electricity, when you're very low carbon electricity, but then another issue is phasing out some nuclear power plants. So Fessenheim, to be decommissioned, means an increase in something like 10 megatons of CO2 from your electricity sector. So how do you reconcile those two?
I'm not so sure about the figures you're giving, but the idea, we have two parallel objectives. One is to reduce the share of nuclear energy to 50% by 2035, I believe. And it started just 10 days ago with the closing down of the first element of the Fessenheim nuclear facility. And at the same time, we are promoting very much the renewable energy. So we hope that we will be able to meet our targets through that.
And for New Zealand, I mean, obviously for our government, one of the biggest issues is how agriculture is dealt with. And there are many issues, climate change issues, water issues, questions, can we maintain current stocking rates on livestock agriculture? Do the farmers themselves in France have a sense of where their sector is heading? And in terms of maybe changes that they will have to make to their practices?
It's difficult to talk about all the farmers. I think there are different views. You have more and more farmers interested by different modes of cultivation and organic production and no use of pesticides. So there are different schools. Those are still in the minority, I believe. And for the vast majority, I think there is acknowledgement that a number of things have to change and can have many benefits. So it's not easy. They will deserve support for this. We have, for instance, a new low carbon label, because there are many initiatives. So it's important also to make sure that the initiatives are sound initiatives, that you don't put low carbon just like this without making any effort. So there is a low carbon label. It's starting in the field of agriculture with some support to farmers who want to use different methods.
Is that also part of the Green Deal, European Green Deal, the agriculture component of that as well? Yeah. Maybe we could talk just a word about the COP. The Madrid COP was the longest in history, and there was an awful lot of hype before the Madrid COP. But it was interesting that one thing President Macron said really struck me. He said he didn't want to go. He didn't intend to go to the COP, and his reasoning was, look, this should be basically it's a more technical COP. And I'm wondering whether we've got when we look trying to make Glasgow a success, are there lessons we can learn from the Madrid COP? My personal impression was that one of the problems with the Madrid COP, it got very overhyped before everyone got there. There was a need to respond to the mobilisation of the youth, the more scary news out of the science, and somehow it just didn't seem to. It seemed to, in terms of the type of negotiations, it struck me, having been at COP since about 2005, there was a real regression in terms of the cooperation amongst negotiators. And one is anything we've learnt there that we can use to help not to avoid that situation?
It's always very difficult when you go and to participate in a COP. Usually, you say you want it to be a resounding success. You want to have very good outcomes, and when you describe the outcomes, you always aim for the best. So, of course, at the end of the day, if you and even if you know that you won't reach the best outcome, but you have, you will never be in a position to have a good outcome if you just say, okay, maybe we will find a compromise, and maybe so you have to be in the objectives you set. You have to be quite ambitious. So at the end of the day, if you don't make it, it's people say it was a failure, and it is exactly the problem we have with ambition. In fact, we knew that the year for ambition was rather 2020 than 2019, but we thought it would be important to already push in this direction at COP25 in order, to make it obvious that we had to deliver something at the latest in 2020. And the EU was there for this. Yeah. The EU managed to do that. Regarding the negotiations, there is essentially one article on which we failed at COP24 and again at COP25, but we failed to reach consensus on something. I can tell you that for a number of European NGOs, it was better not to. They were saying no deal is better than a bad deal.
Yes, so it happened to be the article on markets that our Minister James Shaw got the hospital pass 2 years in a row to try and facilitate.
Yeah, but it's very difficult because so some of the actors of the negotiations are not very clear about what they really want. So it's